Morning, everyone. Welcome to Expect the Unexpected. And today I'm joined by Ethan Dornhelm, Vice President of Analytics Science in our Scores team. And we're going to be discussing the topic of fighting bias and the role of AI model governance. Ethan, thank you for joining me today on this topic.
Sure thing, Scott. Great to be here.
Ethan, let's just get right on into it. Bias is a huge topic of discussion between data scientists, citizens, and our customers. And so, for many, algorithm is a bad word. And so I wanted to, get your perspective on this with respect to, where are we from a public perception around AI and algorithms, learning bias, and what the reality is today when we look at areas like the FICO score, where we spend a huge amount of time focused on building high quality and analytics.
Yeah, I do think there is a great deal of scrutiny and skepticism, I'd say, out there right now regarding AI models in certain segments, and some of it is deserved. Like we've all heard the anecdotes, the facial recognition technology that is considerably less accurate for African Americans, for example. I think what it does is it serves as a reminder, in some ways a positive, that AI isn't the magic bullet. It's not going to solve all of what ails us. It's a powerful tool, but at the end of the day, it's particularly machine learning. It's just another predictive modeling tool that requires the same sort of model governance and careful model design that any modeling technology requires, or else, again, you may end up off the rails, so to speak.
Yeah, I think it's a great point, Ethan. And one of the things that I always think about is, this public perception, the fact that very often, AI is seen as superhuman, but the details of how it works and the interpretability and the ability to explain the outcome so it makes sense to the consumer is really a big part of this, right? So establishing that trust around algorithms is super important in my view with respect to using AI as a tool, not as some sort of secret black box unit that's going to provide some expert insight.
I couldn't agree more. And I think, especially from the perspective I'm coming from, which is the development of the FICO score, I think that notion of transparency and explainability, and even more than being able to explain it, but as you say, being able to explain why intuitively it would make sense to the consumer is so important. I've said it before, I don't know if there's a more scrutinized predictive algorithm out there than the FICO score. It's used in billions of lending decisions. So the fair lending teams, legal teams, risk teams within banks, the thousands of banks that use our score are scrutinizing it. The regulators who examine them are scrutinizing it. And certainly not to be overlooked, the consumers. There's tens of millions of consumers who are monitoring their FICO score on a monthly basis and sort of understanding, seeing how their financial behaviors one month translate to impacts on the FICO score the next. And when you have that level of scrutiny, the ability to really be able to understand what is happening under the hood, to be able to engineer that so that it meets with our understanding and expectations with our 30 plus years of domain expertise in the credit risk field, and being able to then articulate and explain it back to the end users and the consumers is just so critical.
Yeah, agreed. Right. I think it's great. And I'd love to make sure that algorithms are not a dirty word. I think that's a really important thing that we have to focus on. And education, its transparency is super important. So why don't you help us a little bit with, a view into analytic development? I mean, I think FICO score is one of the most interesting sort of and highly visible sort of scores out there, given the legacy of what it's achieved for credit lending. And it's also one that people are asking lots of questions about. So what do you do from an analytic development perspective, with this view of, is public perception perhaps of AI run amok with respect to, the development processes associated with FICO score?
Well, I think it's always important to start by emphasizing that our current design blueprint, when it comes to actually building the final FICO algorithm, really leverages not sort of state-of-the-art cutting-edge machine learning at this point, but rather, I would say, a more time-tested methodology. We call it Scorecard module internally. It's essentially a mixture of nonlinear goal programming with some maximum likelihood estimation. And what we found is that when you've worked on a problem, as we have, of predicting credit risk using traditional credit bureau data, which has been a pretty remarkably stable data source as far as the type of information captured in it, When you've worked on that for 30 years, you've had a chance to really refine things like segmentation logic that captures interactions among variables. We constantly challenge and run horse races of our current modeling technology against state-of-the-art technology. In fact, Scott, you've helped us with that in the past. You've lent us some of your world-class data scientists who have incredible expertise in neural nets, for example, which we use widely in the fraud space. One of the teams that you oversee. And what we consistently find is that we have, through that 30 years of domain expertise, we can get a model that is essentially as predicted, within 1% to 2%, I think is usually the amount of lift we see from using totally unfettered, unconstrained machine learning relative to our conventional methods. And the simple fact is that 1% to 2% just comes at too great of a cost for us from the standpoint of being able to engineer the model, being able to explain the model, and being able to ensure, again, there's a necessary level of transparency for our clients and our consumers. So the way that we use AI, and again, it's a very loose term, but the way that we use more state-of-the-art AI, I would say, is we use it as a powerful way of getting insights, whether that's assessing new data sources, assessing potentially new feature sets, or new segmentation approaches. We use it up front, early in the development, to inform how we might design the final model. But when it comes to building that final model and getting the final output weights and bins and so forth, we go back to our time-tested and highly predictive scorecard module technology.
So I think that's critically important. And when I talk about advances in responsible AI and where we are from an interpretable machine learning algorithm perspective, I always use the scorecard technology as the highest standard, right? Because these are technologies that allow us to deeply understand each individual component of a score. Allows us to make sure that the models are palatable, that we have monotonicity and other sort of really important aspects of making sure that score is reasonable, right? And I think that is really important. And you mentioned within 1% to 2% and not taking that risk for that what was perceived to be a small amount of incremental lift. And I think that's really important, right? It's around this concept of explainability or interpretability first and prediction second, right? And my view on this, Ethan, is that I see the industry moving off the hype cycle of AI is everything and AI God trust AI to let's make sure that we can interpret this, explain it, and that is priority number one. It's always been a priority for the scores team and for FICO overall, right? I'm just hoping and I'm seeing a change in mentality, particularly around folks that are looking at more regulation around AI, around some of those bad news stories that you've mentioned. And so I think, it's coming back to this sort of responsibility around, the gravity of the decisions that we make with these types of scores. And the fact that, there's a lot of care required to build them properly, right? And we're not going to cut corners, right, to try to get a little bit of extra lift and maybe create a huge amount of sort of impact to customers down the line from a ethics perspective or from a stability perspective. Around that, bias is a huge topic today, and there's a big sort of focus around the fact that bias is in the data, right? And so from that perspective, one can look at a model as just a representation of the data, obviously. So from that perspective, if the data is biased, then the model could be biased. And I know this is a topic that you and the team spend a huge amount of time on. Can you speak to a little bit around, the importance of data and what you do with data, with respect to, let's say, the modeling timeframes or the development project associated with the development of a FICO score, given the importance of the fact that, most projects are doomed at the very beginning if they're not focused on data and whether it's unbalanced or biased from the very onset?
Yeah, our timeline for building a typical FICO score is about 7 to 8 months, Scott, much to the chagrin sometimes of leadership. And to your point, a good 5 months of that time frame is upfront from when we receive the raw data through just getting to a point where we have a sample prepared and ready for modeling to begin. So we spend a good 5 months scrutinizing that data every which way, starting from the raw data and making sure it's in the format we expected with the fields populated where we expect them to be, through the data generation, variable generation. In each step, we're doing and running a lot of predefined steps that are required to be signed off on by independent, like an analyst and a reviewer both, looking for outlier values. looking for shifts in distribution over time. So one benefit we have, having been doing this for 30 years, is we have a store of historical data. We can look back and compare the distributions on this new data set we're using to the 5 prior FICO score developments. Again, looking for meaningful shifts that suggest either there's a data quality issue that needs to be addressed, and or there's been a fundamental shift in the market that may cause us to think through the need for new features to capture that additional signal. But every step of the way, we are doing, as you say, we are investing the majority of our time actually in the FICO score development cycle with the QA of the data and making sure the data is as unbiased and as cleansed as possible before we get to that modeling step.
It's good to hear, right, that there's such a lion's share is focused on data and how important that is. And and this is sometimes gets lost, right? I mean, I tend to always get amused, but also scared to death when we look at folks that really applaud people building models in 4 hours in the cloud and calling that a proper score, right? I mean, our customers don't expect that they're going to be judged on things that are slapped together that rapidly, right? And so this care and this analysis of the data up front and comparing it historically over time is a huge advantage, right, to understand what that impact would look like. And I think that talks a lot to the stability of this score over time and our methodology overall. I think the other thing I'd like to just ask you about is, we look at all that data, right? But obviously, there's also this sort of concept of bias drift that I like to talk a little more about, right? Because the FTC has a great quote that says, the model is only ethical essentially, in production, right? So you can build it and develop it, right? But a very big part of this is ensuring that it continues the data that drives this, or the latent features, right? A big focus that I have, continue to behave similarly in a production environment to that of the development environment. So can you comment a little bit about that side around, as the score is out in the wild and how we get feedback about, the performance of that and potential drifts in data?
Absolutely. I mean, one way in which we get feedback, it's maybe a blessing and a challenge of some sort, is by having thousands of clients. Certainly clients are actively monitoring these scores, as you could imagine, on their portfolios. We definitely hear feedback from them if they see unanticipated shifts, which I should say is extremely rare. But in addition to that, we're constantly working with our bureau partners to get regular refreshes, regular feeds of data, even when we're not in a cycle of rebuilding the FICO score, so that we can monitor, just as you say, Scott, the patterns of the predictive variables that go into the FICO score, as well as the FICO score itself, to see if there's any substantive shifts that can't be explained by what's going on in the market. So for example, we saw a huge shift right after the onset of the pandemic, when many borrowers were going into payment accommodation. And really, payment accommodation was becoming an alternative to missing payments and going delinquent on your account. So we saw this sudden cliff in the prevalence of delinquency in the credit file. But again, and we saw an uptick in the average FICO score on the national level as a result. But again, that was entirely expected and explained. But it was important that we captured that, we were checking for that, and we documented it for future posterity, so that it would be another sort of benchmark that we could compare against future economic events.
Yeah, that's really important. And one of the things that we don't talk a lot about, but we do a tremendous amount of work around it, is actually, stress testing these models for different scenarios also, right? And when I talk about this, very often I like to show a picture of an SUV packed up to the roof rack with tools and whatever else, because really we have to understand, what drives these models, what to look for when there might be some dangers in the road. And to your point, how not to overreact, right? During the pandemic, we had a lot of clients, running around like their hair was on fire, not understanding how to remediate a model or to work with a model that might show a distribution in the score distribution, which may or may not, reflect any sort of difference from an odds perspective or the usability of models. So having that confidence, or like a user's manual, is really important, right? Versus trying to be in a crisis and then try to root out making the best decision, because we're not going to make the best decisions, anyone is, in a crisis environment.
Right.
So along those lines, right, of user manuals and sort of, of the care that we take here, can you tell me a little bit more about the model governance process you have? I talk a lot about this and talk about the fact that we want to have a corporately defined model development governance process. that everyone follows, right? I talk about, very often, we don't want to have data scientist artistry at FICO. We can't have Sally wanting to build it differently than Julie, than different than Ethan, right? And so, that would defeat the purpose of having a process that is responsible with respect to how we develop models consistently and use those best practices that we've recorded in Prosperity, and we know that works. So can you talk a little bit about what that looks like sitting in the data science world for the FICO Score?
Yeah, absolutely, Scott. I would, but I would start by saying, and I know you and I are well aligned on this, there certainly is space for data science artistry, but it has to happen in advance of the sort of production level development of a new score. We like to do lots of R&D. We like to give our analysts free rein to kick the tires on different approaches, but not in the midst of a development cycle where you're already committed to a certain time frame and you may end up rushing decisions. We do that off cycle in the years between redevelopment of the FICO Score, and we find that's the best way to at once encourage, I think, innovation and outside the box thinking among our team members, while ensuring that the blueprint, the tried and true blueprint that we're going to rely on, is very carefully thought through and documented, and most importantly, approved by all of the necessary internal stakeholders as part of our model governance. So with that, our model governance, I would say the philosophy primarily centers around document, document, document. I mean, when you deal with a product like ours, which has such longevity, we have hundreds of clients who are still using FICO scores that were built over 20 years ago. It's so critical to have all of that, all of the key decision points in the process documented, not just an understanding of what our blueprint was, but what challenges were come across during that particular development, and what decisions did we make as a result of that, and maybe just as importantly, what decisions did we steer clear of? Which options did we not take, and why did we not take those? Because to expect to have that knowledge 20 years later just sitting around, or to be able to ask someone, even though we have people who have been here 20 plus years, it's a tall order to ask them to recall exactly what we were thinking and what our frame of mind was and what analyses we were looking at to justify the decisions we made 20 years ago. So I would say, Scott, it really starts with this notion of documenting, and the way that we enforce that and ensure a standard of documentation is we have a checklist. It literally is a checklist of all of the key steps that are expected to be undertaken in the development cycle. And at each step of the way, when you complete that step, you will not pass on to the next step until you have achieved sign-off from an independent reviewer, separate from the analyst who conducted that step, as well as you've uploaded artifacts pertaining to, again, the analyses or whatever materials were necessary in order to sign off on that step. And so by having that very clear standard blueprint methodology, as well as that system of checks and balances in signing off on those steps, I'd say that's one of the biggest ways we ensure that for a given FICO development, oops, that QA check that we like to do and want to do every time got overlooked.
Got it. Yeah, and it's really important that we have that process in place, right? And we this concept of allowing a model to be released, and what does that ceremony looks like, right? It becomes pretty detailed, right? We have to demonstrate all those steps were taken. We have to have documentation that it occurred, right? We have to ensure that it was done properly. And I think that talks to why we have 6-month development cycles or longer with multiple scientists and many people involved, right? To ensure that we are making the right decisions or complying with these model development frameworks, and then showing that proof of work, so that at the very end, right, we can get to this point where the model is released. And to your point about data scientist artistry, I mean, it's really important, right? I think to emphasize, right, that point, right? We spend a lot of time, we're generating tons of patents and IP continuously every year, right? As an analytics organization, it's one of the things that I'm very, very proud of, being the chief analytics officer at FICO, having such a tremendously talented group of scientists that innovate. But at the same time, right, they are practical, right? And we're, we know that, our research is not going to be tested live in the wild, right, with our customers. And so, doing that out of cycle and having a formal approval process for when that IP comes into the core development, right? When it gets approved, that might take a year or 2 or 3, right? Depending on the level of intensity that we have or the questions that we have, right? Because we never want we never want our clients or our customers to be, the guinea pigs with respect to technology. And I think that's really important. And so, maybe another LinkedIn Live here with on this expected, unexpected, we could talk about, how to do that, because I think it is a problem, right? I think, in the rush to go and to bring in new technology and to maybe, be a step ahead of everyone else, technology gets rushed in there, and then, unfortunately bad things happen. And the right level of maturity in a process of when you bring in, new ideas and new analytic IP, I think is critically important, both to advancing the field responsibly, right, but also safely. So I appreciate you making that point. So the last point we'll talk about is around systems of immutable record. So very recently, I've kind of focused on this concept of auditable AI, right? Really trying to understand that, okay, if we're going to say that we as as an organization is building models responsibly, we have to demonstrate that we have a process. We have to demonstrate that it's adhered to, and we have to potentially go a step further, which is to really ensure that that is kind of recorded, right? And I talk about blockchain technologies being used in my, in parts of my organization with respect to, persisting in an immutable record. Who worked on what tests were done, what were the latent features, how were they tested, who reviewed the tests and who signed off on it, right? And so, I look at things like that as critically important because it's a proof of work, right? It's something that, we don't have to go back and ask somebody what happened, right? We have that as something that is an asset that comes along with the model development process. So my question for you, given the fact that you have such a strong model development governance process, is, what do you see the future role of auditable AI and some of this transparency around adherence to a model development governance process? How do you see that working, potentially to the benefit of the regulatory environment or the lawmaking environment, where there are more and more scrutiny around, how models are developed and showing a proof of work, so that we're not sitting here claiming to do no evil. We actually have a proof of record how we are working, to do that, and we can demonstrate that.
Yeah, the word that comes to mind is trust, and that immutability, as you said, Scott, of blockchain or of auditable AI more generally. I think one of the appeals of that is if you're keeping your checklist in a Word document or an Excel spreadsheet, there's no real enforcement of, oh, we skipped that step. We want to go back and do it now. Let's just input the date, backdate it essentially. There's none of that opportunity, I think, with blockchain. So one thing I think that it would do very effectively would be to help drive that sort of trust and confidence, not just internally, but as we were showing regulators what had been done and when. So it's sort of a degree of accountability and enforcement that may not otherwise exist. I mean, I think there's opportunity to almost generate, the compliance support documentation directly from blockchain. There may still be some work done figuring out how to extract that, but it's not difficult to imagine this universe where the monitoring we talked about that happens once the model is put into production were to be stored on the blockchain, and right away you wouldn't have this issue where you got asked to show your recent validations and you had to pull them from these disparate places and, oh, what sample did we use for that and what date did we complete that one on? The spirit of blockchain, I think, is that it's there, it's immutable, and it's for all time. And I think there's some definite appeal there. And it would, I think, drive just increased comfort and confidence in the regulatory community of what they were being shared.
Yeah, I agree, Ethan. And I think it's a really important point. And, what I've noticed as we use these sort of technologies is that it drives, a really important part of responsible AI, which is accountability, right? It actually, when you're asked to sign something, right, and to put your name against it, whether it be in a blockchain or some other sort of, compliance document, I mean, that means something. People will take a pause and understand there's some gravity to that, right? And for many, that's a scary thing, right, to put your name against, right? But it's so critically important that we have that in place. And, for those that are listening that don't have these processes in place, it might feel a little bit like a little heavy-handed, right? But in some sense, right, what I've seen as I talk to different organizations is data scientists are kind of starving for, some level of guidance, like a guidebook to follow, right? They want to do the right things, right? And they need to have the tools and the processes around them to do so that, yes, they can go, right? These are tremendously complex projects that we do, right? And, breaking into the piece parts and ensuring that we're doing each piece part appropriately and signing off along those will build a foundation for what needs to be something that everyone has confidence in. I'm going to be having a conversation with Courtney Abercrombie on the next of these sessions, and she gave me some insights around the fact that data scientists are just many of them are very, very worried and scared and troubled that AI ethics and these decisions lie on one or two data scientists without these frameworks. So I think it's really important in terms of providing data scientists the support that we, as analytic leaders, can enable them to be working in an environment where they know that they're following a process, and that process is kind of one that's responsible for building these models. But also, having that proof of record for regulators and for ourselves, right, as things shift. So I really think audible AI, I think, will be a really big part of where we move forward as an industry.
I think so. And, you reminded me of one other thing I wanted to highlight, which is that I feel AI can also be part of that comfort, part of that review. Just to give one example, when we build scorecards, we will sometimes build that model. We will do that, what do you call it, the 4-hour AI build, right? Not because we have any intention of releasing that in the wild, but rather because that provides a very valuable benchmark for understanding what's the upper bound of predictive power that we believe we could get on this particular scorecard that we're building. And we've had instances, one in particular comes to mind, where that upper bound was dramatically, typically we'll see, as I said, a couple percentage points more effective, Gini, KS, however you want to measure it. But we had an instance where it was 20% more predictive than the model we built with Scorecard. And that caused us to say, wait a minute, is there some powerful signal that we're missing? It turned out that when we pulled together the Scorecard sample, we simply overlooked an entire class of predictors that we meant to include in the model. And so again, it helped us in that sense that it pointed us to a mistake we'd made that we otherwise probably would not have caught, as far as variables that could be included in the model that hadn't been included in the candidate set. So again, I want to tout AI as well, that speed, that highly predictive nature of it. It can be used for really powerful things, even if you're not going to roll out the final model in unconstrained, unfettered AI.
Yeah, excellent. Well, great example, right, of where these processes, help us, but also help our customers with, models that are built well and then highly predictive, right, and to ensure that mistakes aren't being made, given the complexity here. I think, as I see the industry, I see more and more responsible AI and AI frameworks being discussed. NIST is talking about it right now while we're doing this LinkedIn Live, right? I mean, there's a lot of people focused on this, a lot of work streams. I'm in like 3 right now, right? So it's like the hot topic. What I'm really thrilled about is that FICO and the FICO Score already have great methodologies, and will continue to enhance it. That's part of it, right? To look at these processes and improve them over time, and to do so in a very cogent and conscious way. So I appreciate your leadership, Ethan, and everything that the Scores team does here, and having that model development governance around how we develop these is really helpful and important for our business. And I'm sure those that listened in, learned quite a bit also. So thank you for that, Ethan.
Well, thank you, Scott. I really appreciate the efforts you're making on the explainable AI front. I really think that frontier, using AI to push us all forward by some mixture of the domain and human expertise, coupled with the ability to better understand what's happening under the hood of AI, is really where we're headed as a company, probably as a data science community. So thank you for your pioneering efforts there.
Thank you, Ethan. Okay, so next we have Coffee with Klaus and Bar Moses. So if you can join that's November 9th at 9 a.m. Pacific. The topic is really around data, and data being at the heart of digital transformation. So for those that are interested in that, please join Klaus Molt, our CTO, and Bar Moses for that. It should be very, very interesting. I also wanted to share that today I released a blog talking about responsible AI. Those that follow me know that this is a tremendous passion of mine and everyone at FICO. And in that blog, there's an AI playbook. So if you're interested in kind of seeing the kind of a combination of different sort of insights that we've talked about over the year, it's a great place to kind of look at that in one place and to get those insights. And finally, I mentioned it already, But I'm really excited to have the next LinkedIn Live, expect the unexpected session with Courtney Abercrombie. She's the founder and CEO of AI Truth, tremendous collaborating colleague, and I'm really looking forward to that conversation as we round out this series on responsible AI. So with that, I hope everyone has a great rest of their days, and thank you for tuning in with us.
Thank you.